Nicola Graham-Kevan is a psychologist and professor of criminal justice psychology at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston. She's also a professor of clinical psychology at the Mid-Sweden University in Östersund in Sweden. And we've been lucky enough to talk with her about the position of men and women in the prison system. Well, Nicola, what we wanted to talk with you about is your work in your department about the situation that men and women find themselves in the criminal justice system. And we were very interested in what you were saying about men and women in prison and what's happening there. Tell us about that.
So I've got interested in prison and the criminal justice system in terms of men and women's experiences, professionals, perspectives, and how that guides the approach we take with men and women. That isn't to say that the criminal justice system is perfect for anybody. It isn't, and it never will be. It's a massive system. It has many competing needs, societal, people work there, people who live in prisons and so forth. So it's complex, and it's not to say that, anybody could ever fix it. And generally, it seems to work reasonably well in the UK compared to other Western nations. I think our prison service is humane and, does, on the whole, try its very best to provide a rehabilitative culture for our inmates. However, there is quite a difference between how we view men and women within the criminal justice system. And I personally, just from my reading and research generally and working with people in prison, don't believe that this distinction which is being drawn is actually a helpful one or an evidence-based one. I think it's more around our feelings about who needs protection and who needs to be managed in society generally. So,
And what's the distinction you're referring to?
So the concern in criminal justice is predominantly around female offenders and young offenders. If you're a young man, then yeah, there's still some concern around your needs. But really, for adult men in the prison population, they are at the bottom of a line in terms of the type of regime you have, the expectations, whether indeed you should be imprisoned at all. Those conversations seem to be lacking when we're talking about men, but absolutely at the forefront when we talk about women and to a lesser extent young people. And when we talk about women, we even if you go to a women's prison, I've been to one, and it's really it was nice for a prison. It was more sort of blocks, and people lived in sort of dormitories almost. And the conversation there is very much about whether women should be in prison at all, how their offending is understood through a lens of trauma. So they're victimised, their trauma histories in childhood and in relationships has difficulties which have led to their offending behaviour. And this whole approach is very much compassionate, rehabilitative, seeing needs rather before risk, looking for reasons for the behaviour rooted in the individual trying to navigate a difficult life. But this dialogue is largely lacking with adult men in the prison system.
And do you think that's because everybody thinks they understand already why men are in prison, why they might have committed offences? Is that because there's an assumption about men, which means you don't have to ask the questions?
Yeah, that is an interesting way of phrasing it. It's not actually one that anyone has phrased it like that before. It's almost, there's a presumption that you know why men are in there. But then I honestly think if you actually directly ask somebody, so what is it that drives men? They would probably pause to articulate what it is we think the reason men are in prison versus women. And it's around this idea that men they make decisions. So they make logical decisions, around control and power and resources, and like their rational choice almost. Whereas women are more the victim of circumstance. These poor environments women grow up in, and abusive relationships and situations they experience mean that women are less almost able to make these decisions, that they're there through victimhood, whereas men are there through planning and poor decisions, possibly.
They brought it on themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. And as a woman, it's a very sexist position, it's almost like we're going back to the knights and the damsels. To have all women as victimized and vulnerable and needing protecting, and all men as dangerous and needing containing, is a deeply sexist position.
It's also about needing to be punished, isn't it, Nikki?
Yeah.
That's the impression I've always had, that these men, these boys need to, need to be told what's what, and need to be punished.
Yes, very much so. And we see this right through. So there's this presumption, and I believed it as well, that women, because if they get involved in criminal justice, they are more harshly treated because they step outside the gender role. And that's just not borne out by research. But women at each stage of the criminal justice process, from whether somebody phones the police to actually report, say, a woman being violent, is much less likely than if it's a man being violent. The police will take the woman's violence less dangerous, less impactful than a man's using the same behaviours. Women are more likely to not get cautioned at the scene. So men are more likely to be arrested. If for those who are men and women who are arrested, men are more likely to be charged. For men and women who are charged, men are more likely to be taken to court. The CPS is more likely to prosecute. For men and women who end up in court, women are more likely to get a conditional discharge. Or for those who are sentenced, men will get a longer prison sentence, more likely immediate custody, less likely community orders. So all along the line, we're actually moving women away from the criminal justice system. We're diverting them. So, we're diverting them at every stage. And that's an appropriate response. I don't think prison should be a point of first call for anybody. It's a difficult place for everybody, including those who work there and those who live there. And it should be our last resort. But what happens is you have women being peeled off at each stage. And so what happens then for the female estate is the women who actually end up in prison are the most complex women. So you have a very complex cohort who end up in prison. Now for men, the threshold for imprisonment far lower. So the men who end up in prison, you've still got the massive complex cohort, but you've also got the less complex people who, had they been female, probably wouldn't be in prison at all. So you've got a bigger range in the male estate. So that's already benefited women in the fact that we're less likely to have this most restrictive and draconian, punishment, which is the deprivation of liberty. So already, as women, we're sort of benefiting from this concern for us. But then it is then used to show that actually men and women go to prison for different things. And indeed they do at that level. But women are more complex is what you'll see a lot through all the literature. Women are more likely to have complex needs. And therefore, for women's estate, we need to be trauma-informed. We need to have a really rehabilitative culture and so forth. But within the men's estate, they have exactly the same cohort of highly complex men. But what they will do is they'll say, for example, 70% of women will have, adverse childhood experiences. And they'll say compared to only 62% of men. But that cohort of men, there are more men per actual human beings. There are more human males with complex needs in prison than human females. But it's diluted down. It's acting like women only become involved in crime if they have this high complexity, whereas men are just like that. they're just men. Men are just tricky, difficult. Men need to be controlled, and therefore you get this dual position where women need it trauma-informed, complex needs care, and men don't. Men don't need that. Just have a look at the Home Office documents on men and women. I mean, even if you did a sentiment tracking, you would see for women it's complexity, abuse, victimisation, the words all the time. And for men, it's risk, dangerousness, sex offence, violence. It's even the word usage is different.
This is a complete minefield to wander into from the point of view of making assumptions about gender roles and, you know, how the two sexes behave, because I mean, if you listen to people like Jordan Peterson, they'll talk about gender roles, describing how men may create the framework for society and then women organise themselves around it. In other words, there's a narrative there which suggests that built into society, just the way humans work as a species, men kind of create the opportunities and women organise themselves around those opportunities in a kind of hierarchy within that gender. And I mean, I've no idea. This is you know, you could speculate forever about why these things happen. I mean, the other thing I wanted to throw in is my experience in psychiatric hospital. That is, that if you weed out the people who don't need to be in hospital, you end up with a very dysfunctional ward, because all the people in the ward are very mentally ill and their behaviour is very difficult. And it was always rather welcome to have quite a lot of people who could go home, but you didn't rush them out, because they absorbed an awful lot of the friction that was going on between the difficult patients. In other words, rather like a nuclear reactor, you put in the rods, which were the normal, or virtually normal people, and they would soak up some of the hassle that otherwise the staff would have to soak up. And so you didn't need to do so much actual work with the difficult patients, because the people who are well were soaking up some of that. So I don't know if that would be part of the dynamic as well.
That is so interesting, because certainly I've never worked in a women's estate. I'd like to, but what I hear consistently when I talk to people who do, and people who've worked across male and female estate, is that women, there's far more, disordered behaviour. There's far more likely to be somebody, getting upset and breaking things and shouting, and the self-harming and yeah. Now you're saying that, it makes me think that in the male estate we've got the less disordered people who are soaking up. Yeah,
some of the hassle.
It sounds exactly the same. Yeah, absolutely.
I would expect that.
Before, but yeah.
And then the staff will be quite keen to have the less dysfunctional men in, because actually it helps the atmosphere of the place. I mean, we had people, the prison service did not want them, because they were, they'd be in mental hospital. They weren't really mentally ill. They were personality disordered. They were just difficult personalities. Yeah. But nobody wanted them, because the prison certainly didn't want them, because they just caused a load of trouble. And they were, I'm not sure they were much better off in a psychiatric hospital. But decisions would be made, and that's what would happen. But you certainly couldn't let them out in the street, because then everybody was in trouble. But the public have to absorb that. The next door neighbours would have to absorb it, and the people in the shops would have to absorb it. So you could kind of dilute this dysfunction a lot, but more and more people then start protesting about it. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think that actually fits as well with what I've heard through, the youth estate, so youth crime, is that because they've been, and I think we all very much support this idea of do not imprison, try not to criminalise young people. Let's give them the opportunity before we start putting them down such a route. That there's been such a massive drive to diversion with young people that the estate now is smaller, but it is highly complex.
Yeah.
And then even for the impact of people working there, you get far few easy wins. You get far few wins altogether, because you're in a system where you've got a level of complexity that the system isn't actually fit to, not able to address in a way that's useful. But yeah, it certainly seems to be the case with the youth estate as well. So it's interesting. So where does society go? In prison, people who don't need to be there to take a hit for the rest of us.
Well, I fear that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just really interesting, though, that there is this assumption. I would like to know when does the boy become the perpetrator? Because certainly, like if you're looking at refuge provision, there's a number of refuges, and certainly in the US, it's quite commonplace where boys can't enter once they hit a certain age. So at some point, people are saying, you're a victim, you're a victim, you're a victim, you're a victim. Now you hit 10, 12, suddenly you morph. So everyone's fine to say that young boys can be abused and maltreated and suffer adverse childhood experiences. We're all fine. We're all aware of that. The Wales study, it's 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. It's boys are more likely to have 4 or more, but you don't really tend to hear that. But what I'm interested in is, even when we recognise that, what do we think happened then? Why do we not then see it in an 18-year-old who's been put in prison? Why do we not say, well, we know, these people are coming from trauma, they're coming from adversity, and it doesn't matter if they're male or female, they're a product. Go on, sorry.
Well, I was involved in representing people in criminal proceedings for about 10 years when I first started. So we are going back quite a long time, Nikki, but I mean, the majority of the bread and butter work that you do, if you do a lot of crime, is men, but young men. The majority of work that you end up having is fights. They go to the pub, they earn a bit of money, they go to the pub, and there's a fight on a Saturday. And I worked in a kind of market town in Wiltshire, where on a Monday morning you would go in and you'd see the blood. The blood would spattered down the pavement, out of the pubs. And, you would know that there would be a fight. And if you hadn't been called out, you'd know Monday was court day in the town I was in. And the same people turned up week after week. And they were on this conveyor belt, they get put in prison, they come out, they got better at fighting, they had more fights, the fights became more serious. And these were young men who I liked. They had, if you work in a way which I did, where you don't get them coming into your office very much, you go to where they live. You see how they live, you see the circumstances that they've grown up in. And it's obvious how much harm they've had as children and as young people, and how worthless they feel, and how much lack of opportunity they've had. But I don't think ordinary members of the public see enough of that, Nikki. They don't experience any of it. But that's my. I mean, I did serious crime as well, and you're in a different ball game as well with that. But the majority of the work is these young men, and they need help. They don't need to be locked up on a regular basis. And the more you lock them up, the harder they become, and the more they have to prove themselves. Because the youngsters are coming up behind them and are thinking that they can kind of take them off their perches, as it were. And they had to get harder and harder. And girls were getting pregnant, they were fathering children, with a number of girls. They hardly, half the girls didn't even know who they were having sex with. I mean, that was kind of ordinary life. And that's in a small market town.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
But people don't realise, they don't realise that actually these kids have had no, when they were kids, they had no proper education. Their upbringing was poor. They came from families that didn't have jobs. Dad didn't work. often there weren't dads around. There was just mums, and mums were very young. That was another thing. Mums could get a flat to live in if you had a baby. And so you had very young girls in flats, and having numerous babies, you know. I don't know why people don't understand that these are complicated situations and with serious adverse experiences for them. But it's just not seen, is it? I don't know why it's not seen.
Well, it's nobody wants to see it.
I suppose it must
It's
be.
simple as that, isn't it? If you can warehouse them somewhere in their 20s and 30s, then they're off the scene. And on
the whole, I mean, the other thing is they're thought of as dangerous, frightening people, and I never found that. I mean, you'd see them if you got called into the police station when they were still drunk. You'd see what they were like, but even then, I never felt frightened. Never felt frightened. And I've had some frightening experiences in the police station, but they're different stories. But never felt frightened by them. And their story, they tell you their stories, and if you ask them, they tell you what life was like. They didn't keep it a secret even. They were willing to tell you, if you asked them, and you spoke to them like they were just normal human beings, they would open up and they'd tell you whatever you wanted to know. And I find it extraordinary that these people are so misrepresented and seen as dangerous, impossible to help people. It's because they just don't get the opportunities. It's as simple as that, I think.
And I think people are afraid of recognising trauma because they think that you're then going to let them off. So you're going to say, well, we don't have to go to prison because they had all this adversity. And some people do need to be in a secure environment.
They do.
Because of what's happened to them means they actually shouldn't be outside for the public safety, but for their own safety as well. I mean, most of the people who end up seriously injured or killed in a fight are often the very same people who go down for the murder. The murder of people who are, living in leafy suburbs is far less likely than people living on the same estate, living next door, growing up in similar situations. So, but the point being is that, it isn't you're either a victim and therefore you should be given a pass, or you're completely calculated bad person, so we should lock you up and throw away the key. That sort of dichotomous thinking is where it seems to be with men, and it's not. If we recognise your trauma, but recognise that you are currently showing need of sort of support, that the safest thing for everybody is that you are incarcerated, I'm okay with that, and I'm sure the guys are. I mean, when I worked in a secure hospital, some of the guys were in no hurry to move through that system because it was the first time they'd had a bed that they felt safe in, and and meals, and for some people say, prisons like it's too easy and so forth. Well, if being in a prison cell where you're locked up and told what to do and given very little autonomy and not even on really what you're eating or when you get into bed, and if that's a good life, then what was their life like?
Well, that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, quite.
Absolutely. But of course, it depends on people not knowing what prison is like and not understanding what the regime actually consists of. Because if you can make that comparison, like if this is a better option, then what is it you're escaping from outside?
Exactly. Yeah. And what I found when I worked with people, and we've done it in prison, and we've used the trauma-informed approach in the community as well with men and women, but I'll talk about men because they're ones who don't normally get this approach. If you say, like, afterwards, how did you find it? They really, really appreciate the trauma-informed approach. But if you say to them, was it easier than the other programs? They say, no, it's harder. And this is including like sex offenders taking a trauma-informed approach. It's harder because you've actually got to do the work, and it's emotional work, and it's threatening. So, you've got to really engage. You can't just give them the right answers. You've got to engage and reflect and, look deeper and really start unpicking your own behaviour.
So
and that's hard.
Just interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you, but the trauma-informed approach, I think, is encapsulated by this, saying, you need to talk about what happened to you rather than what you did. Because people can talk about what they did and accept the punishment, and that doesn't involve any hard work emotionally. But if you want to talk about what happened to you, you then have to unpick traumatic experiences, painful experiences, which may be shameful or you feel ashamed of them, but certainly you don't want to be reminded of them. It's much easier to talk about what you did in terms of the crime you committed than talk about the painful experience you may have had through your childhood. And that's the reason why, as you say, it's harder work, because you're inviting people to talk about stuff that they would really rather not talk about. It's much easier to say what the crime was and how they did it, or denied doing it, or whatever that they're going to say about that.
Absolutely. And you don't have to. I mean, when we work, we'll do a one-to-one assessment, trauma-informed, so we do developmental history, we understand what was difficult for them growing up, what thoughts and emotions got tied up with that, and how these things become sore spots in the future. But why did that fight go so far? Why you're out every weekend, and why was that fight the one that went where it did? What was different about that? And you'll often find it is something around those sore spots are being triggered either immediately before or in the day or even in that situation. And that's important for them to know, so that they recognise that it's from their own experience, not necessarily what's going on in this situation. So to recognise what situations are more risky for them. And then really, in what the work I do is we don't go there after that. There's no need. What we get to in that session is we understand these were tricky, whether you blocked them off or not. That isn't good. We validate that was an awful experience for you to have. It shouldn't have happened. Well done for still being alive and trying and engaging in things, where other people may not have got this far with those experiences. That was hard. And it's led to you having sensitivities around certain emotions and thoughts. And that can mean you get a bigger reaction than you would otherwise. And they understand that then. And then it's like, right, so what do we need to do about it? And everything after that is building that skill base and getting that recognition that these strong emotions that you're feeling, they can be managed. These are all the different techniques we can use. Some work sometimes for situations, but sometimes you need something else. You need all this flexible approach. And you get that positive thing now. You start building on it, and you can start feeling some autonomy and self-control and like hope that things can be different, because that you're not just a bad person. That anybody who'd had that experience you had would find it difficult. So it normalizes your experience.
One of the paradoxes about that kind of approach, though, is, firstly, that it seems much more painful for the person having to do the talking to dig into their experience, and yet afterwards they will tell you that they were pleased because you've listened to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they may not want to talk about it, but having talked about it and maybe been very upset whilst talking about it, they will often say they feel better for having done that. And that's the other side of that coin is that most people don't want to inflict pain on the person they're talking to. So the professional or whoever it is who's responsible for working with that individual may want to avoid picking the scab off these painful scars. I'm mixing my metaphors here. Painful wounds, and so you avoid doing it because you don't want to sit in the room with somebody who may get very distressed, and then you have to deal with their reaction. So there's often a reason why people don't want to get into that kind of work, because it's for the therapist or the worker, it's also hard work, because you have to contain the emotion that you then unpack, and you have to be confident that you're going to be able to end the session in a reasonable way and not just leave the person in a terrible state. So there are reasons why people are reluctant to get involved in that kind of work, and it's easier to talk about what you did and how bad you were and how much you need to be punished. And take the medicine, mate. Be a man, and let's not talk about the painful stuff. So it's easy to avoid it. It's easy to avoid it, and I think there's probably a silent contract agreed between both, I don't know, what do we call it, victim, survivor, and professional, which is, let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about like what you did. It's easier.
Yeah.
So
and actually part of that as well is that people who choose to work in caring services, in psychology, in the prison service, the police force, these are often people who've also had quite a lot of adversity growing up.
oh yes, there's two reasons. There's two ways into the asylum. One way you get paid, and the other you don't.
Absolutely, and that can be that can be a barrier for those people, and it's something I think there's a lot of trauma-informed training going on, and I'm really happy about it. We need as much as we can, but then you've got to have that elephant in the room addressed. So a lot of the people you're training will have had these adversities, and that can then create a barrier, because you can have that feeling. It's like, well, I experienced that thing and I'm not hurting people. And it's like,
Right.
you need to also have the knowledge of the literature, which is like, so the people who don't go, the people who we see in prison service and psychiatric services, they're the people who didn't have protective factors. Or it could literally be, so the protective factor could be literally their genetic makeup. So you've got certain genes like the MAOA gene, the warrior gene, where if you've got a certain variant on that gene, you'll be very, very adversely impacted by a difficult upbringing. But if you have a normal upbringing, a nice upbringing, you'll be the same as everybody else. You have these gene environment interactions. So you can have, you can say, well, my brother's gone off the rails, but the rest of us, we were all brought up in the same house and we're fine. It's like, well, yeah, maybe you were lucky. You didn't have, there are so many genes they're finding now, which collectively, the quantitative trait loci, varying genes of varying expression sort of loads that can contribute to whether you're going to be able to be resilient. And even amongst these professionals, but like ourselves, who are being resilient and have this adversity, and we're doing well. Yeah, are you working 20 hours a day? Is that not just the same as someone's using substances? Are you actually living, or are you distracting yourself with work or extreme sports and marathon running? And even people who can appear really functional can be manifesting really behaviours that on their deathbed they think, why the hell did I spend 12 hours a day on my telephone?
That requires some insight, which is painful.
Yeah.
And as you were said right from the start, that's not an approach that's offered to men. There's a culture which you're describing in the men's prisons, which is like, we won't talk about it and we won't ask about it. You just do your time, presumably, and put up with it.
I mean, particularly sexual abuse. I mean, sexual abuse of boys and men, massive taboo subject. It's huge, and yet when you look at some of the work like Survivors Manchester do, and I heard Duncan Craig, who runs Survivors Manchester, and he came from lived experience, and he's been going into prisons and just going into talking groups, nothing to do with sexual abuse. But then when it's actually opened up and the conversation goes to that, like 12 of the 30 men are saying, yeah, I've had that experience, but they've never said anything to anybody ever, because I've got daughters. You worry daughters are going to get grabbed on the way home and abused, assaulted, or because you think about sexual assault as being a female thing, but how doubly difficult then is it for men, when we never even asked. And yet there's so much of what men experience is absolutely not even spoken about.
But that's actually quite an encouraging project, isn't it, in Manchester, because
very much so.
He is being allowed into the prisons, and he is being allowed to run groups in the prisons. And as you say, in the group of 13, where 2 of them were members of the staff, 12 of them admitted to childhood abusive experiences. So there's a kind of openness being allowed in that context, which is very encouraging. But that's a local project, isn't it? That's Manchester and its near environment. But is there anything else like that elsewhere in the country that you know of?
I'm sure there's pockets of amazing practice throughout the country, and it's often from the survivor point of view who, realise that when they experienced it, there wasn't anywhere obvious. And I think that is some of the real problems with the way our support networks, the front-facing aspect of them, is so gendered. So rape crisis and the whole dialogue around sexual abuse is very much framed as a woman's issue. And therefore men don't think it's appropriate for them, and we see the same obviously in domestic abuse as well, where so men don't see that is a place they could go for support. So then you need these specific organisations. But I personally don't support the need for gendered services. I mean, you need them now because of the philosophy and the ethos in services which are very, say, female centred, may actually be actively, not conducive to male support. But I mean, you don't have female mental health units. I mean, what worked for, if you were going to do, an IAPT thing for your doctor, you wouldn't get a different one for a woman than a man. So
we've come some distance. I mean, what I'm thinking about while you talk is that I was a junior doctor at the time when Jimmy Savile was put in charge of Broadmoor Hospital. And that is such a wonderful combination of appalling decisions, which seem to have been thought of as sensible by, senior members of the government, senior members of the NHS estate, senior members of the prison service. And you talk about, we don't need gendered services, but there are some people who delight in gendered services, and Jimmy Savile was a wonderful example, who I mean, what on earth that was about is the most extraordinary episode.
Well, you'd hope it wouldn't happen now, but I wonder.
I just hope that we have moved on from that because,
I think, did we ever have an inquiry?
Into what?
Jimmy Savile.
Well, there was, but there wasn't one. I mean, he was there because of an inquiry into Broadmoor, wasn't he? That's why he turned up there. Yeah. Now, he went there as a solution to Broadmoor's problems, which is just anyway.
Well, I was going to say
far too complicated to understand.
Will we have another Jimmy Savile? Well, yes, because we haven't learned the lessons from why.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. There has been no actual public inquiry. I don't think heads of road, I don't think lessons have been learned, because it was all so terrible from the bottom to the top, wasn't it, that nobody was motivated to go in and,
But if they can't spot a Jimmy Savile, who can they spot? Because he was hardly subtle about his bizarre motivations. I mean, he was and he was spotted. I mean, nobody. Anyway, I mean, I don't want to get stuck on that because it's kind of history. But I think what it underlines is the blindness that people, the public, choose to have, and it is a choice, I think, in the face of grossly abnormal decision making or grossly abnormal institutions. And as you say, there may be more health, as it were, in the female prisoner state than there is in the male prisoner state. But the reasons for people's behaviour are very difficult to talk about because people have got a lot to hide, and that by that I mean the professionals involved have got a lot to hide about themselves and about the way they're working and about what they're doing to the inmates. Nobody wants to talk about it, and that's why Jimmy Savile could survive, is because nobody wanted to talk about it. They all knew what was happening. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And as long as nobody wants to talk about it, and you're somebody talking about it, but most people don't want to, it can persist.
And so, I think part of why we find our prison and police, and how we can find that individual officers are behaving in ways which is callous and appears callous, is because on top of this high complexity, you have a target-driven, under-resourced, and I'm not saying just throw money at it because it's far more complex than that, but you've got a system that doesn't allow people to have human connection. So, if you're a police officer called to say domestic, then you've got your dispatch saying, are you still there? Come on, there's another call. Wrap it up, get moving, next call. If you're a prison officer, it's like you've got all this to be doing, you've got things to do, you haven't got the time to go in and sit on someone's cell and just have a chat. And yet if you look at the desistance literature, never mind us psychologists and psychiatrists saying we need all this deep work, of course we're going to say that. It's like when you watch House, the cancer guy sees cancer, and the hormone guy sees hormones and so forth. But, if you look at the desistance literature, some of the most powerful things that happen in prison is that prison officer who goes and sits on the bed and says, how's it going? And looks at you and treats you like a human. Well, most people who went into service would like to do that. But if you put people in a system that is under-resourced, then, so everybody's suffering, then we get a siege mentality, don't we? Where we literally, it's of them and us, we're just going to survive the day, and thank God I've handed in my keys and I'm in my car park now. So the whole system is inhumane for everybody, not just the inmates.
What's the solution, Nikki? We're feeling a bit weak at this end of the, the conversation.
I think the solution is to take a trauma-informed approach across male and female estates, 100%, to reassure the public that this is not this isn't letting people off. Somebody was harmed, someone might be dead. You still have to do your time. But what we want is when you come out, you come out safer. Yeah. And you come out safer not because we've kept you in so long that you're too old to offend, or we've like damaged you so much that you just don't function. You come out safer because the reasons that you found yourselves in these situations that put you inside, that work's been done. And the fact is, really, what we need to be is upstream, and we need to be. All my family come from teaching backgrounds. And any infant school teacher can tell you who's going to be in prison. They could give, if they could put money on it, put odds on, there'd be a lot of rich teachers, because they can tell you exactly who's going to be in prison, and they can tell you that when they're 4 years old. Not all of them, but most of them, they can spot them. So what is it that 4-year-old is doing that we could get in there? What is it that we need to do when we're 4 years old? When it's so much easier. Because you get to adolescence, you get synaptic pruning, there's little windows of opportunity. Children have compulsory education. They're small, so if they do kick you, they're not going to really damage you. They're easier to manage, and you've got them 8 hours a day. So even if you can't intervene with the families effectively, why is there not this really enriched, evidence-based approach early? To help these children, and it saves everybody the misery. We could empty our prisons, I feel, largely. We could empty them if we could get those early years right.
Here.
Those children don't get the funding they need, do they?
Don't.
Or the families that look after those children. There's always a queue at the till, for the money, and the children don't have the voice. And they're not the children people feel sorry for either. They're other people's children. They're the children of people that you don't see.
But also they're the children that, are not behaving well, aren't they? They are exhibiting behaviours which people don't like. And but that's the warning sign, isn't it? It's, that should be what signals the need for help. Not that attitude over, that ghastly child. It's totally wrong, isn't it?
I think the technical term is little shit. Off the record. a little shit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but absolutely. But what happens instead is we have Ofsted, we have a national curriculum, and we put our teachers under immense pressure with targets and learning things that nobody needs to know. We never teach children about emotions in any effective way, and if we do, it's like a one-off. But the life skills, but it gives you the actual framework for learning, actually gives you a structure to build on. It's just largely absent, isn't it, in our education system? It's as if what you've got to do is learn facts. And, learning facts in itself annoys me because there's only perspectives. There's very few actual facts in the world. So, there's in academia, no matter what you say.
Hang on, Nikki.
In academia, no matter what you say, somebody's got a line of research who contradicts you.
Humanities. Let's put them aside. That's quite right.
Even theoretical physics. Mathematicians. It's everywhere. But the point is if you can help by working with the families, and hopefully you can, but maybe you can't always do that. But school could be that environment that gives you 8 hours a day, 7 hours a day.
Well, it certainly allows you to spot the problems, even if the teachers aren't the right people to actually be doing the work, because there is a teaching role to be had. But,
absolutely, yes.
But spotting the problem and dealing with it professionally, rather than funding other projects later on in life when it's too late already, would be so sensible if you could just motivate people to fund it.
And just looking at the sharp end is the criminal justice system and the mental health system, but at the lower level you just only have to look around at people and in your own family, and there's a lot of people who are unhappy and dissatisfied with life, although we have riches beyond a lot of people in the world's wildest dreams. So everybody would benefit from more well-being. And for children to be with children who are a bit disruptive, but it's managed in a way that is constructive so that they get that emotional intelligence to start understanding behaviour which you find annoying or frightening, there's stuff under it that I can understand, help me mentalise and understand other people. That's going to help you navigate the world as well. So even for those children who can sit through a classroom, I don't think it's the worst thing, having these other children who find it more difficult. If there's time and space to be managed, and there's a community, the little classroom, a little village almost in itself, that little village works it out together, everyone benefits, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you can legislate for people to be happy, because life is a vale of tears, really. But you can organise it so you don't make it worse. Yeah. And maybe the little shit service is the one that we should be promoting, really. Spot them early and intervene constructively.
Definitely.
Rather than leaving it to the prison service when really things have gone far too far and too late.
Absolutely. And so we have to change the narrative about men and women. If we want equality, and I think we do, then that cuts both ways. That means that if we care about not enough women in boardrooms, we care about too many men being homeless. If we care about too many women, not wanting to go out at night, then we also care about the fact that the prisons is 80% men. But men are only 50% of the population. That shows there is absolute discrimination against men. And you can say, well, they do more offences. Well, as we've said, if you control for offence type, men are still more likely to be in prison. But if we take prison as a life gone wrong, then we have to accept that there is systemic discrimination against men throughout their childhoods that leads to them being more likely to be homeless, more likely to be substance users, more likely to be in prison.
Yes.
That's systemic discrimination.
Nikki, that's a tremendous summary of what we've talked about. And we have to thank you very much for giving us your time.
Great discussion. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you very much indeed.
No, thanks for asking me. It's been interesting talking to you as well. You've made me go away and think about a different perspective on a couple of things too, which is really
Good.
nice. Yeah.
Good.
Bye then.
Thank you.